So, what if I told you that all the messy, complex conflicts in our world, we're talking everything from huge international power plays to the crazy divisions inside a single country, could all be boiled down to one simple biological drive: the drive to survive. We're about to dive into a really fascinating theory that sees geopolitics not as a clash of ideas, but as a primal fight for resources, kind of like you'd see in the animal kingdom.
This quote right here is the core of it all. The source we're digging into argues that for all our fancy technology and modern society, the way nations act hasn't really changed. At the end of the day, it's still an ancient, primal fight for territory and for dominance.
All right, so how does this actually work? Well, the main idea is to think of countries like animal packs. We're all on this one planet, right? With limited space, limited resources, and just like a pack of wolves has to fight for its hunting grounds, this framework says nations are basically locked in a constant battle to survive and get what they need. So this way of looking at geopolitics kind of tosses out the usual labels we use like democracy versus communism. Instead, it says a nation's actions are driven by something way more basic, a gut instinct. The focus isn't on what a country believes in, but what it biologically needs to do to keep going.
Now, according to this theory, that primal struggle for survival naturally creates two fundamentally different kinds of powers. And these two opposing mindsets, what the source calls sea power versus land power, have pretty much shaped the entire course of world history.
Let's break this down, because this is the key difference. Sea powers are all about looking outward. Their lifeblood is trade, and trade needs individual freedom. It needs risk takers. You can't have a centralized government controlling a merchant sailing off into the unknown. But land powers, they're the exact opposite. They're inward-looking. Their strength comes from controlling a huge chunk of territory and all the people on it. And to do that, you absolutely need a strong, centralized government to manage everything.
And we can see this in the real world. Think about modern Japan, an island nation that completely depends on trade over the sea. That's a classic sea power. Now contrast that with the great land empires from history. Ancient Egypt, ancient China, and even modern Russia and China. Their power has always been about controlling vast lands and the people living there.
So the really crucial takeaway here is that these aren't just military things or lines on a map. These two different survival strategies, looking out versus looking in, logically lead to two totally different political and economic systems.
And here's how that geopolitical mindset actually shapes a whole society. A sea power mentality, which is all about individual merchants and being self-reliant, well, it naturally creates the perfect environment for capitalism. But on the flip side, a land power mentality, which needs the state to grab all the resources and then hand them out to everybody, that is, by its very nature, a socialist structure. The state has to control everything for the good of the group. According to the source, this isn't just some abstract theory. It explains huge moments in history. The author suggests that the real reason socialist revolutions worked in places like Russia and China is because those nations already had this deep, ancient land power tradition of a strong central state. The ideology of socialism just fit perfectly into the mold that was already there. Okay, but now this is where things get really, really interesting. This whole framework isn't just for comparing different countries. The source argues you can use it to explain the deep, angry divisions inside a single nation. So let's take a look at the United States through this lens. And that brings up a really good question, right? America is one country, but man, it feels like it's being torn in two different directions all the time. How is that even possible? Well, the source's answer is that America basically has both of these mindsets fighting it out internally. It says the original spirit of the American westward expansion was pure sea power. Settlers relying on themselves with tons of open space. That, it argues, is the root of the Republican Party's whole ideology. But then, later on, as new immigrants came and packed into coastal cities without any land of their own, a land power mentality started to grow. People demanding that the state step in and redistribute wealth. And this, the source says, is the foundation of the Democratic Party. So, what decides which of these two mindsets gets the upper hand? According to this theory, it's pretty simple: the economy. When times are good, people feel strong, they feel self-reliant, and that sea power message of individual freedom really hits home. But when the economy tanks, people feel helpless, they feel scared, and they start looking to the state for help. And that's when the land power message of government support and redistribution becomes way more popular. And following that logic, the source makes its most controversial claim. It says that for the land power-style Democratic Party to win elections, it needs a population that depends on the state for help.
It alleges that a key part of this strategy is to encourage immigration of people who are more likely to need government support to get by. The source then looks at recent American history through this very specific lens. It points to the Obama administration's policies as a move to grow this class of people who depend on the state. It sees the Trump administration's tough restrictions as a direct move to stop that. And finally, it frames the Biden administration's policies as the final step, an attempt to turn these new dependents into a solid, reliable voting bloc. All right, now let's see how this same idea gets applied somewhere else. The source is pretty clear that this isn't just an American thing, and it uses the exact same framework to analyze what's going on in Japan.
And that makes you wonder, right? Is this internal fight between sea power and land power just a uniquely American problem, or can we actually see a similar pattern playing out in other countries, like Japan?
Well, the source's answer is a definite yes. It claims this same dynamic is absolutely happening in Japan. It says there's a political faction which it calls land power that's pushing for a strategy that looks almost identical to the one it says the Democrats are using in the United States. So the source claims there's a specific playbook being used here. The alleged goal is to completely change the country's demographics and its economy. So from this viewpoint, pushing for more immigration and giving non-citizens the right to vote, it's not just about diversity. It's about building a bigger group of people who rely on welfare. The source even makes the claim that weakening the economy on purpose helps this goal because it makes more people need government support. And all of that allegedly would lock in political power for this land power faction for good. So if we follow this whole geopolitical idea all the way to the end, then every election becomes about something way bigger. It's not just a choice between different parties or candidates anymore. It becomes a fundamental choice about what kind of country you want to live in.
And the source frames that choice in these really stark terms. On one side, you've got the path of the land power, a state with total central control, kind of like China. And on the other side, you've got the path of the sea power, a state built on individual freedom and self-reliance, like the original idea of America.
And that, right there, is a huge question this theory leaves us with. It's a challenge, really, for us to look past all the daily political noise and ask a much deeper question. What kind of society are we actually voting for? Is it going to be one where the state manages our lives, or one where we, as individuals, are ultimately responsible? It's a powerful and definitely provocative way to see the world.